Okay, moving on to the venules now. We finished up with the capillaries. The venules have much thinner walls than veins do. Part of the reason is because they're coming straight from capillaries. And so venules themselves, they basically look a whole lot like big fat capillaries. They don't have a whole lot of tunica media yet because you haven't had the full transition over to veins. And basically, by the time you start with the smaller venules and graduate up to larger venules, the establishment of the three layers, the tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa, have all been established. But you're still going to find a much thinner tunica media with lots and lots and lots of connective tissue compared to arteries. Venules themselves are collecting blood from capillaries and returning blood back to the heart. So the venules eventually feed into veins, which is what we're looking at here. And I'm going to change my pointer color here to blue since we're dealing with the deoxygenated blood content. And so what we're looking at here on our veins are some really cool valves. So these valves are much like the valves in the heart, and what their purpose is to prevent backflow down the leg, in this example, from higher chambers to lower chambers. So when you're looking at this particular posterior view of the lower leg, you have like the smaller saphenous veins and femoral vein leading up to the femoral vein. And so the smaller veins are going to be feeding into the venules, feeding into this vein here. And so what happens is when you're standing still, the blood vessels have very little compression on them from the adjacent muscles. When you stand on your toes here, the gastrocnemius contracts, and that contraction puts pressure on the sides of the femoral vein, and the vein then starts closing up and pushing blood up into the next chamber. So you have blood flow going upwards here, farther up into the leg. As the muscles relax, the chamber opens up again and can be refilled with blood being pushed up through similar muscular contractions from the smaller blood vessels. And so basically what's happening here is you have blood flowing up against gravity through the assistance of what's called muscle pumps. You're going to talk about that a little bit more in physiology. Now, one of the issues with this particular structure is if there's a problem with the valve and the valve collapses, for example. So let's say that this particular valve here, instead of the valve walls pointing upwards, they break down and blood starts flowing back down through the vein. That's when we have the situation called a varicose vein. Varicose vein does not allow the even transport of blood through veins up through the lower appendages, and basically blood starts clotting and backs up in that vein. It's a very painful process. And so varicose veins can be removed and replaced with cadaver vein or veins from other parts of the body. So what about the circulatory route of our body? So basically, as you saw in the heart before, in the heart videos before, we have blood entering, and this is funny because it's red here. The reason why it's red in this figure is because we're looking at fetal circulation. Usually blood enters from the superior inferior vena cava into the right atrium, goes down through the right ventricle, out through the pulmonary arch to the lungs, branching out here to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries. Blood returns from circulation through the pulmonary veins, drains out through the pulmonary arteries, the aortas, and out to the body. Over here, it's a little bit different in fetal circulation because of, remember this, the foramen ovule. So here's the inferior and superior vena cava draining into the right atrium, but early on during development, before the lungs are fully developed, the foramen ovule allows a kind of a sidetrack here, a blood flow from the right atrium to the left atrium, where then the blood can go from the left atrium to the left ventricle, and it's pretty much deoxygenated blood out to systemic circulation through the aorta. Now, what's interesting about this is that we're totally bypassing here, not totally, but somewhat bypassing the pulmonary trunk, okay, the pulmonary route, leaving through the pulmonary arteries here. Why is that important? Well, when babies are still developing inside the mother, we have a situation where the placenta is bringing in fetal circulation. So this is the circulation coming in from the mother. So you have the oxygenated blood coming here in red through the umbilical circulation, bringing blood up through the inferior vena cava into the heart. This blood is going to be carrying oxygenated blood out to the body, where then the heart pumps it out to the different systems of the body. We have the circulation going to the liver, circulation going out to the kidneys, which you can't see here. And then eventually the umbilical arteries drain out into the placenta. Now look at this. This is kind of interesting. The umbilical vein is bringing in oxygenated blood. This is another situation, rare situation, where a vein is bringing oxygenated blood into the heart. Can you think of the other situation? I'll let you think of that yourself. Over here, you have umbilical arteries draining deoxygenated blood from the developing fetus. Can you think about where else you would see arteries containing deoxygenated blood? Just think about that. It might show up on your lab exam or your lecture exam. So over here is a short, kind of a enlarged version of circulation after delivery, shortly after delivery. Oops, sorry about that. And what we're looking at is the establishment of the closed ovule foramen, where now you have basically a blockage between the right and the left atrium, and blood flow becomes established like we normally see it. Deoxygenated blood coming in from the inferior and superior vena cava into the right atrium, down to the right ventricle, out through the pulmonary trunk to the right and the left lungs. Blood will then return in through the left atrium into the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta to the brachiocephalic and so forth. So that's the end of part 1, which is basic circulation, arteries, veins, capillaries. We're going to speak briefly about the lymphatic system and lymphatic circulation. And basically what the lymphatic system is doing is picking up all of the additional fluid that drains out of capillary beds into tissues. So when we come and look at, I'm going to back up here for a second. So over here, we're looking at an artery and a vein. We know that arteries and veins don't have a whole lot of leakiness to them, but capillaries do. Remember, at the level of capillaries, this is where you have fluid escaping from, basically it's plasma, escaping from the bloodstream in addition to nutrients and oxygen and the diffusion of waste products back into the bloodstream. Well, all of that fluid has to be picked up somewhere and returned to the heart, and that happens at the level of the lymphatic system. So the lower lymphatics, you'll find a lot of lymphatic lacteals in the lower extremities. Each one of these little knots here are lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are regions that are kind of like little chambers that have a whole lot of, they act like filters. There are a lot of lymphocytes in there, killing any pathogens that might have entered at the level of your tissues. And then the tissue, or the fluid, is transported up through the body and is eventually emptied into the heart. So what is the lymphatic system doing? It produces and maintains and distributes lymph. Lymph is the fluid that is picked up from interstitial fluid within tissues. So whenever you see swelling in a tissue, when you have edema, that is basically because fluid somehow was either extra fluid was dumped into the tissue or fluid was not picked up by the lymphatic system. What the lymphatic system basically allows us to do is maintain a normal blood volume, and it helps maintain the composition of interstitial fluid by picking up the additional fluid volume in the tissues. It also gives you a different route of transport for nutrients and waste products and hormones, and fats especially. Fats are transported around through the lymphatic system. So here's a real nice drawing of what the blood vessels look like coming into a tissue. So here's an arteriole right here. You can see little smooth muscle sphincters that allow or that control blood coming into a capillary bed. Capillary is going to allow oxygen to be dropped off into tissues and for CO2 to diffuse back into the bloodstream, which I'm identifying here as blue. Right here, this yellow set of cells, kind of yellow goldish, that is our lacteal, or our lymph vessel. The lymph vessel is going to be picking up any additional fluid that has leaked out from our capillary beds. And so they're indicating that in black. I was trying to use yellow here. But basically what lymph capillaries are, I call them lacteals. That's one of the technical terms for them. The lymph capillaries are picking up fluid and sending the fluid back up to larger vessels, lymph vessels. What's really cool about this is that they tend to travel in the same direction as capillary flow. So here is a blood vessel, a capillary containing oxygenated blood. Here's a capillary containing deoxygenated blood. And our lymphatic capillaries are going to be transporting fluid, lymph, back up to the venous system. And so the lymphatic drainage comes all the way up through the body and ends up draining through the thoracic duct, which collects blood from the left part of the head, the neck, the arm, the lower body. So this is a really big duct. And it drops it into the left subclavian vein. All right, so here's the left subclavian vein right here. So most of the lymphatic drainage goes into the left subclavian vein, not brain, sorry. The right lymphatic duct is just the head, neck, and arms, all right, from the right side. And that drains into the right subclavian vein, which is right over here. So look at the tremendous amount of fluid coming into the left subclavian. So one of the things that's really important here is ensuring that the left subclavian is always open for the adequate return of fluid to the circulatory system. Lymph nodes themselves, like I said, act kind of like filters. Sometimes they've been called lymph glands. We mostly call them lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are the things that the doctor always palpitates under your jaw to see if you have an infection. They're usually between 0.4 to an inch long. They can be kind of roundish or kind of like they say bean shaped, kind of like a little pinto bean, frankly. They have a hilus, a capsule, trabeculae. Here's our little trabeculae word again, right? And remember what trabeculae are. They're these kind of infoldings of a tissue, all right? Reticular fibers, and then you have a cortex and a medulla. Here we are, cortex and medulla again. So let's start on the outside. We have the outer capsule here, which is a bunch of connective tissue through which the afferent vessels drain into, and you'll see that these lymphatic vessels have, again, valves that allow one-way drainage into the lymph node. Inside of the lymph node, you have the cortex, which is all the region here in black. The cortex looks like a series of kind of stacked cells. And then you have medulla. Medulla is going to be kind of a looser aggregation. So the afferent vessels bring fluid into the lymph node. Efferent vessels take fluid out. So lymph circulation, basically fluids collected through the lymph capillaries near capillary beds. They merge into lymphatic vessels. The vessels move the fluid to lymph nodes. The lymph nodes then also allow the movement of fluid through the cortex, a medullary sinus, which is inside of the lymph nodes. That's where lymphocytes attack bacteria or debris or virus particles to kill them in the lymph nodes. The lymph itself then goes through the hilus, and then the lymph vessels eventually merge the trunks into lymph trunks, and then the lymph trunks go to the thoracic duct, which would be all that major part of the left thoracic duct or the right lymphatic duct. So skeletal muscles also help to move lymph through the lymphatic system, just like a muscle pumping system. So lymphatic tissues are connective tissues that have lots of lymphocytes in them. So lymphoid nodules you'll find in the respiratory system, the digestive system, urinary, reproductive systems. For example, the palatine tonsils and the adenoids are lymphatic tissues, and basically these are lymph nodes that live inside of tissues. Lymphatic organs are going to be, of course, the lymph nodes, the thymus gland, which is a part of the lymphatic system, and the spleen. This is the largest lymphatic organ. It helps remove red blood cells. It helps store iron, and it helps get rid of extra B and T cells after they've been activated through an infection. The last focus I would like for you guys to work on are looking at these figures here. to look at the basic organization of the lymphatic system and study the lymphatic vessels and organs.